Okay, good morning, everybody. Why don't we get started? It's a little past 10 a.m. Thanks for joining us and tuning in. Just as a reminder, everybody will start off muted for this webinar. And I'll just go through the briefing, and if you have any questions, you can type it in the question box or raise your hand, and John Bravender is standing by, and he'll be able to unmute you at the end, and I'll be able to take your questions. This session is being recorded, and we'll be sure to post a link to the recording after we're all done here. So to get started, I'll start with the summary of the dry season, the May through September dry season that we just completed. And not surprisingly, across the state, most locations had below average rainfall through the dry season. Most areas of the state did start off the dry season drought-free because of wet conditions earlier in the year. The big exception was Maui County, and that's because they had a wet season, 2019-2020 wet season compared to other counties. And so they got a head start as far as drought impacts. And so by the end of September, they ended up with the worst drought conditions across the state. In some areas, especially leeward areas of Molokai and Maui, they ended up with D3 conditions, which is the extreme drought category in the U.S. Drought Monitor map. And that has really affected agriculture operations, especially the ranching sector, where pasture conditions are extremely bad. And water conditions, the public water supply has also been affected. So the Maui County Department of Water has asked for conservation from water users for the upcountry and West Maui water systems. And even on Oahu, the Honolulu Board of Water Supply most recently, they requested water conservation measures from the public for the entire island of Oahu. So things have been pretty dry lately. When you look at the statistics for the dry season, it ended up being the 11th driest dry season over the last 30 years. And so it's not even really close to record breaking by any means. However, I think there are a couple of factors in play as far as the perception from the public. And it's the intensity of the drought late in the dry season. So August and September were extremely dry. And I think that really stands out in people's minds. And the other thing to remember is that in the last 7 years, really we've had wetter conditions across the state in the dry season. So in the last 7 years, five of the last dry seasons have actually been fairly wet. And it's only 2 out of the last 7, including this one, that has had a drier than average conditions. So looking forward or moving forward for the October through April wet season that we just started, NOAA's Climate Prediction Center has stated that we're in a La Nina event, and La Nina conditions are expected to persist through spring of next year. And in terms of the long-range climate models, the consensus of these models project that there will be wetter than average conditions across the Hawaiian Islands region through April, at least April of next year. So actually, the models on a month-by-month look, the models are showing October to start off drier than average and then transition in November, and then wetter than average conditions in the large scale starting in December and then continuing through April. So one thing that we'll be really paying attention to is the strength of the La Nina event, because the strength of the La Nina can affect what the rainfall distribution will be during the wet season. So if we have a stronger La Nina event, then rainfall may favor the east-facing windward slopes, and that's because with the stronger La Nina events, we can have a higher than normal trade wind frequency during the winter months. And if the La Nina is going to be on the weaker side, then we'll be able to see more weather systems that could provide significant rainfall in the leeward areas. And so in terms of drought recovery moving forward, there's a higher chance that drought recovery will occur in the western half of the state from Kauai to Molokai. and also on the windward slopes of Maui and the Big Island. However, there is a chance, though, that especially if the La Nina event ends up being stronger, then drought as it exists now could persist through the wet season. And we'll probably see some improvements in drought conditions. However, they may not completely go away by the end of April when the wet season ends. And so that's just something that we'll have to stay tuned to and be on the lookout for. So that's ends the wet season outlook, and I'll take any and all questions that you may have.
Thank you, Kevin. John Burnett, so you have your hand up. Let me unmute you. Unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question. Looks like you're muted from your side.
Sorry, I'm not hearing anything right now.
No.
Can you type the question in?
Yeah, go ahead and type the question in, or click the red microphone in the upper right to unmute yourself to ask your question.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Okay, great. Does any of this is this at all interrelated to what appears to be a relatively mild hurricane season that we've had so far?
Yes, with the La Nina event, we tend to have the Central Pacific and even the East Pacific tend to have a quieter than normal hurricane season, and so they go hand in hand with the lack of tropical cyclone activity, and that's also affecting the Atlantic. The Atlantic is usually opposite from the East Pacific and the Central Pacific, so the Atlantic has been very busy, as you know, in terms of the hurricane season. And we've been quiet, and that's because of the La Nina going on right now.
Okay, next question we have, Michael Phillips. You're unmuted. Go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Kevin. Some have pointed out that while we're headed to La Nina, that the Northern Pacific is really anomalously warm than it usually is in a La Nina forecast scenario. Can you talk about that? I've heard that as it relates to mainland weather, that would typically throw a wrench in things with mainland forecast trends in the La Nina season, but what's the impact to Hawaii?
I'm not too sure about the far North Pacific warm anomalies as it affects us, but I do know that in more recent La Nina events, the Northwest Pacific has tended to be warmer than average, and then that has translated to our La Nina events being a bit drier than normal. If you recall back, and this is going back to the 1950s and into about the early 1980s, the common, I guess the trends were that La Nina events tended to be wet and El Nino events were dry for the Central Pacific near the Hawaiian Islands during the wet season. But in more recent events, especially since the mid-1980s, the La Nina events have tended to be drier, and I should couch that by saying more regional dryness, meaning that the windward side will stay wet, but the leeward sides have sometimes stayed dry. And so that's why in the outlook, I threw some caution in there because of the potential for drought as it exists now, because it's drought so significant in some areas of the state, it could persist through the wet season. And this happened back in 2010 to 2011 wet season. We started the wet season with a pretty significant drought. In fact, it was worse than it is right now. We had even D4, which is exceptional drought category, and then several areas of extreme drought in the state. And by the end of the 2011 wet season, April 2011, several areas were still in dry conditions and drought conditions. And so, there's the potential that if the drought stays too strong, that we could see the drought conditions persist in the leeward areas. For the windward areas of the state, I think chances are pretty good that drought will be eliminated, and we'll see some pretty wet conditions. Some of these La Nina events have produced pretty big rain events, especially for instance, Hilo area on the Big Island for John Burnett, who just spoke earlier. Back in the 2008 event, we had a really large 4-day, 40 inches of rain, I believe it was, in the Hilo and Puna areas. And so, the La Nina can produce quite a bit of windward rainfall, but in the leeward areas, it could persist, especially again if the La Nina stays too strong.
Okay, Kevin, we have a typed question submitted by Mark C. asks, could you explain what exactly is, or what you mean by La Nina event?
Oh, good question. That's El Nino and La Nina. These are large-scale climate cycles in the Pacific, and that relates to anomalous warming in the case of El Nino near the equator of the sea surface temperatures. And La Nina is the flip side of that, meaning anomalously cool sea surface temperatures near the equator. And these conditions can translate to atmospheric effects. And because we're so close to the equator and the deep tropics of the Pacific, that these can have downstream effects that affect our climate, and especially during the winter months here in the islands. And so with El Nino events, there's a really strong likelihood that we'll have statewide drought, especially from January through about March of the El Nino year. And usually these El Nino events will tend to peak during the winter months. And on La Nina, we could see the flip side, but as I mentioned, that if it'll depend on the strength of the La Nina. And we also have insole neutral conditions, which is in between El Nino and La Nina states. So sea surface temperatures are near normal, they're near the equator. And so with insole neutral conditions, we tend to be pretty wet. In fact, 7 out of the last 10 of the 10 wet seasons have occurred during insole neutral years.
Great, thank you. Another question from Michael Phillips. I see your hand up. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
It's been 2 years since we've seen significant volcanic emissions coming from Kilauea. Can you talk about, or can you talk to how the lack of emissions in the last 2 years influences the weather or not, especially during wet season in Hawaii?
From what I've heard or what I've read in the literature, the volcanic emissions will actually tend to hinder rainfall, and the lack of that's due to the cloud microphysics properties, where if you have too many volcanic aerosols in the air, then there's a process that's called precipitation scavenging, where there's just too many cloud condensation nuclei, and it hinders the warm rainfall process. So it makes the rainfall less efficient, the rainfall production less efficient. And so with the lack of volcanic emissions, it would you would think that conditions return to normal or back to regular type of rainfall. I know maybe it's a little too early to tell, but the last couple of summers on the Kona side of the Big Island, they've had pretty wet summer season. And now on the Kona slopes of the Big Island, the summer is their normal wet season. But if you look at this, past May through September, the Kona slopes, at least, it's consistent with the reports I've been getting and then the rainfall data that I've seen, they've had a very wet summer. In fact, Waiaha rain gauge has had, close to double of their normal rainfall for this past summer. So that kind of, it's supportive of the argument that the lack of volcanic emissions would be more helpful to rainfall. And so with the volcano continuing to be fairly quiet, it could help them with their rainfall on the Kona side. But it is, they're getting out of their normal wet season. So, I think they may be looking forward to some drier conditions, because from what I understand, they've been pretty soaked on the Kona slopes this summer, which is really interesting when you compare it to the rest of the state, especially Maui County, where they've been suffering under pretty dry conditions, but the Kona slopes have been fairly wet.
Great. Next question, Mark Carpenter. I see your hand up. You're unmuted. Go ahead, unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello there. First off, apologies for the basic sounding questions. I'm just trying to wrap my mind around everything. First off, how long does a La Nina event last? And then also too, in last year's outlook, you had mentioned, the factor of warmer sea temperatures leading to more thunderstorms. Is that going to be the case this year?
The sea surface temperatures, well, good question, by the way. And the sea surface temperatures, and I'm glad you brought that up because they've been not as warm this year compared to last year. And so that has helped our summer temperatures. Actually, last year, if you remember, we were breaking all kinds of high temperature records in it. And it's been warm this year, but not as warm. And we have had above average temperatures this summer, but not quite as bad as last year. And these warm temperatures are expected to persist through the wet season. And so we're expecting conditions to be a bit warmer than average. And the warmer temperatures over in the ocean, as far as the sea surface temperatures go, can contribute to moisture, adding more moisture to the air mass. It may contribute to more rainfall. But we'll have to see what the upper levels do as well. And again, if the low level winds will continue to favor trade winds, then the rainfall will be emphasized over the windward slopes, the east-facing slopes. And so, as far as in terms of your first question, how long do these events last? They last about a year or so. They tend to start developing during the summer, and then they'll peak during the winter months, and then start to fade out during the spring. However, you can have a double event. That is definitely possible. We've had conditions or years where we get past the winter and then a second round of La Nina occurs. So we could see 2 years in a row of La Nina. And going on the flip side, if we were to have an El Nino, we could also have 2 El Ninos in a row. Usually they just last through one cycle or 1 year. You might have a La Nina event and then it'll trend back to neutral conditions. And then we'll have to see what happens during the early part of summer to see if that'll switch into either an El Nino event, or it could stay in ENSO neutral conditions, or if we get another La Nina. 3 years in a row, I think is extremely rare. So I think we could see 2 in a row, but beyond that, not real likely.
Next question is from Louise Rocket. I've unmuted you. Unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
I'm asking questions about West Maui. We've had two fires. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Go ahead.
Oh, okay, good. It's really, really dry here, as you earlier noted. Normally we have the first rain in like mid-November. I don't see, do you have any prognosis or prediction when we will be seeing our first rainfall on this side of the island?
Looking through the rest of this month anyway, it looks like after we get this event that's going through now, which will mainly affect Kauai and potentially Oahu, we might revert back into trade wind conditions. So not real likely, but we'll have to see. I think I mentioned earlier that the long range, the climate models had been projecting October was going to be dry, and then transition in November, and then really start getting wet in December. So, it looks, chances are more likely that you'll see your first event in West Maui in November. But, again, if the La Nina really gets going, gets too strong, the rainfall may be limited to the windward side of West Maui. So you might get some rainfall up on Pu'ukukui, and then it's going to be tantalizingly close. You're going to see rainfall up there and maybe even in the upper slopes of West Maui. But as far as rainfall getting down into the lower section, if it continues, if the trades stay are more frequent than average, then the lower slopes of West Maui might not get too much, unfortunately.
That's pretty brown. Thank you for your answer.
That looks all, oh, okay. Malika, I see your question. Go ahead and unmute. No, there you go. Go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Kevin. Hi, John. Hi, everyone. So on that note, talking about West Maui and places that are really dry, can you talk about the potential negative impacts when a really dry area gets a lot of rain? Because we're talking about, you know, we really need the rain, we really need the rain, but sometimes that can lead to flooding. And yeah, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, you don't want to have a situation where you get your drought relief, but it happens too fast, where the rainfall is just too intense, and rather than percolating down into the soil and recharging your groundwater supplies, it just mainly goes into runoff and causes flood problems. You know, and the ground is also pretty bare too, and so initially you're going to have a lot of topsoil erosion, and that'll cause problems too. So, you know, the best type of rain is really more steady, slow rainfall that lasts all day and allows the ground to soak it up a lot more. And you really don't want to get into a situation where, you know, you get near normal rainfall, but it all occurs in a couple of weeks. And so, you know, that's just really not the ideal situation. So it'd be best if the rainfall is spread out over, you know, weeks and months, and that'll really help your soil moisture situation, your groundwater supplies. And you know, West Maui depends on surface water runoff as well, and for the supplies. And so you know, you really need to have a lot more rainfall in the leeward areas. And the same thing for upcountry, though upcountry will get their water from windward slopes of Haleakala. And so, you know, I think there's a better chance that the supplies there will be replenished, but you know, West Maui may be a different story. You know, I'm not the water supply person there, so I don't know all the specifics of the West Maui water system, of course, but you know, that's from my basic understanding is that West Maui receives a certain amount of their water from surface water sources.
Next question is from Michael Phillips. Go ahead, Michael.
This is a basic question. So we have dry and wet season. Can you elaborate on just how wet season is compared to dry season typically?
I think you'll find that the biggest contrast between wet and dry season is primarily in the leeward sections of the state, so the south and west facing slopes. You know, the windward sides and the east facing slopes will get, they have multiple peaks during the year typically, and in some places you might have 3 peaks in rainfall: March, July, and then December/January timeframe. And so because of the trade wind rainfall, and then also during the east facing slopes can get rainfall during weather disturbances. But the leeward sections, you know, they have a distinct peak in the winter months. So December, January, February timeframe, especially, or really the October through April timeframe, is when the leeward slopes get most of their rain. And then the summer or / dry season is when you see a distinct minimum in rainfall. And so, for instance, if you take Honolulu Airport, you see that the wettest month of the year is strongly in December, and then the driest months of the year is like in the July timeframe, June, July timeframe. So, you know, I guess when you refer to a wet and dry season, it's primarily geared toward the leeward sections where you have the biggest signal. Windward areas, well, you'll have some dry off, but again, you can have a July or August peak for the windward sections because of trade wind rainfall, and even the remnants of a tropical disturbance, let's say, that's embedded within the trades may bring an uptick in rainfall for the windward sides, but that rainfall won't get into the leeward areas.
Okay, next question is from Mark Carpenter. Mark, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask.
Well, yeah, as a follow-up to that, so what you're saying is, you know, that would be the case, but when you have a La Nina event, that would mean that windward sides are going to be getting the rain, while leeward, you're going to have a wet season where it's going to probably continue to be dry. And then a second part of that question is, you know, just to reiterate what you said, we're going to be expecting wetter than average conditions in the large scale for this wet season. However, because drought is so severe in some areas, it might not be enough to alleviate that and provide some relief.
Exactly. Yeah, and also I want to caution in terms of the La Nina in leeward areas. It's really dependent on how strong that La Nina event will be. If it's a weaker La Nina, then I think there's a higher chance that the leeward areas will get good rainfall. In fact, we could get very high amounts of rainfall in the leeward sections. But in some of the strong La Ninas that we've had, for instance, 1999. 2011, stronger events, the leeward areas, they got some rain events. That doesn't mean, I'm not saying that they're not going to get any rain. It's just going to be below average, below what they normally get. And so you might have a couple of rain events and then return back to significant trades and pretty dry conditions for these leeward areas. And so, for the areas that don't get much, for instance, the larger islands in the east, so Maui and the Big Island, looking at areas like Kihei or West Maui, as we talked about earlier, South Kohala region on the Big Island, they depend on more in the leeward areas, Kona type weather situations where you have south and west winds as opposed to trade winds. They depend on those types of systems to come through to provide a lot of their rainfall. Honolulu is another one. Honolulu Airport in downtown area. They really depend on these either cold fronts to come through or Kona lows to develop, where you bring in a lot of moist southerly winds and rain bands to come through into the leeward areas, as opposed to having trade wind rainfall, which produces most of the rainfall on the east-facing slopes and perhaps up in the Mauka regions, but doesn't quite get into leeward areas such as Waianae or Ewa or downtown Honolulu.
Okay, Kevin, we have two more typed questions here, and then we'll wrap this up. Nina Wu asks, with warmer than average temperatures expected through April, will that mean more humidity and possibly thunderstorms with the rains? Does the La Nina year also mean more humidity?
The La Nina year is, it's defined by conditions near the equator, and our local temperatures and humidity is dependent more on what the local sea surface temperatures are doing. In this case, what we have this year is that our temperatures remain slightly above average, and they're projected to remain above average through the wet season. And so we'll probably have warmer temperatures and then higher moisture content, so higher humidities for the rest of the wet season. And with the weather systems that come during this time of year, especially if we're going to get these upper level lows, regardless of if we could have trade wind conditions or Kona type winds, if we have strong upper level lows that create a lot of instability, then these systems can produce a lot of lightning. So you can have lightning, thunderstorms, even with trade wind conditions. And also, of course, if we have Kona type winds from the south and west with these larger low pressure systems, then of course these can produce quite a bit of lightning as well. So, and if we have more humidity, higher ocean temperatures, then that these conditions can produce more fuel for heavy rain and potentially more unstable conditions and lightning storms. But the thunderstorms are also dependent on the upper level instability. So we'll have to see, what results from that.
And then another question from John Burnett. Is the Kona rainy season in the summer anomalous, even compared to leeward sides of the other islands? If so, is there a reason why that a layman might understand?
Yeah, the Kona Slopes region of the state, it's a leeward section of the island, but it's unique in the state of Hawaii, where it's the only leeward area that has a distinct summertime rainfall maximum. And the reason for that is because during the summertime, when you have very persistent trade winds, you can establish a very regular afternoon upslope flow that creates clouds and showers during the late afternoon hours. And it's because it's a regular feature because of the persistent trade winds, and you get that afternoon upslope flow, then the rainfall is fairly regular. And as I just mentioned too, that the rainfall, it also has a distinct peak in the afternoon hours. It's not something that you'll see usually in the morning. That's in the afternoon when the clouds develop over the slopes, then the rainfall will develop out of that. And so it's the only leeward section in the state that has a distinct summertime rainfall max. And so that's why leading into the dry season, I always cite the Kona Slopes region as an exception because they don't have a dry season. The dry season is really applies to the rest of the state. They get their rainfall mainly during the summer months.
Okay, actually, one more quick question for Mark. When was the last La Nina event that we had?
Oh, good question. I believe it was 2017. Hold on. It was the 2017-2018 wet season. So it was a weak to moderate event. Didn't get too bad. And it was also a double La Nina, meaning that the 2016-2017 wet season was weak La Nina, and then the following wet season we went into a La Nina again. It went slow. During the summer it went back to neutral, and La Nina came in again during the following wet season.
Great, thank you very much, Kevin. That looks like we wrapped up all the questions.
All right, thanks for checking in and catching our webinar, Wet Season Outlook. Thanks for your time.
And we'll post this recorded video to our YouTube page and send out a link like we did with the media release.